Well, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. I know that we had some snow and ice up here. I'm pretty sure they had more ice down south. So hopefully everyone's safe and sound wherever you're at. If you remember from last week, I said that last week would be the first in a three-part series that had us look at some of the most important figures, peoples, and kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. And we looked at the Franks and the Frankish Empire and Charlemagne. This second week of our series, we'll turn our attention to the British Isles. At the time, one of the great hotbeds of learning and knowledge, especially in the context of the church in all of Europe. We'll start by setting up some of the historical context of what was Roman Britannia. Then we'll look more broadly at the deep, rich monastic tradition there in the British Isles. We'll talk about the Anglo-Saxons, who they were, where they came from, and then we'll focus in on Alfred, eventual king of the Anglo-Saxons, defender of the kingdom of Wessex, perhaps the most learned monarch of the entirety of the medieval period, and the only English-born monarch to ever have the title the Great, Alfred the Great. To frame where we are in our time with Alfred, we need to consider the context of what we know today as Roman Britain and post-Roman Britain. See, for Rome, despite all the land that they held sway over at the beginning of the millennium or close to it, there was always one place that seemed largely outside of their feasible reach, a land full of untamed wilds and savage barbarian tribes, and that was Britannia. Britain at this time, in a limited way, was sort of known to a handful of European civilizations as early as the 4th century BC. There's records of the Greeks, Carthage, Phoenicia, having traded for tin that had been mined in Cornwall, which is in the southwest of England. And while there are a couple of individuals who have said to have visited from the continent to Britain during this time, that's never been proven. And to the writers of this time, this is a place of great mystery. If you can see the picture, that's Stonehenge. That's just one prime example of some of the great mystery that Britain posed to earlier civilizations, and then even to Rome when they landed. Some writers, for a time, even said Britain couldn't be a place. There couldn't be such a place as this island. The first verifiable record we have of European contact, the first record of note, comes from, of all people, Julius Caesar. Thinking that the Britons were helping the tribes of Gaul during his Gallic Wars, he sent two expeditions there, one in 55 and one in 54 BC, and he managed to extract tribute and captives from a number of tribes there and install a pro-Roman king there in the southeast toward Kent. For a number of years after these incursions, Rome and Britain essentially developed a somewhat friendly relationship of diplomacy and trade. And by the end of actually the reign of Caesar's successor, Augustus, we're told by the writer Strabo, the historian Strabo, that taxes on trade goods from Britain, just taxes on trade goods, brought in more wealth to Rome than any military conquest could. And the archaeological record in Britain actually shows they too, at the time, were importing large numbers of luxury goods from across the Roman world that you could never find in Britain. But despite this, larger invasions were planned of Britain a number of times during this period. Augustus himself planned an invasion 3 different times, but none of those came to fruition. And Rome sort of committed to a policy of supporting client kings or almost puppet kings in Britain until about 39 or 40 AD. At that time, the guy who was emperor, Caligula, planned a massive invasion in support of actually a client king who had fled Britain to Rome. Possibly as many as 200,000 men. But so the legend goes, we're told that upon reaching the shore of the English Channel, the mad Emperor Caligula called off the invasion and ordered his men to collect seashells. When Rome did finally invade in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius sent 3 divisions of the Roman army, as many as 40,000 men, and landed in modern Kent. And the Romans, with little trouble at all, really fought their way up the River Thames, and then they eventually forced the surrender of many of the tribes along the river. And we're told that when Claudius himself arrived in Britain after the victory was certain, he brought with him a sign, truly perhaps the greatest sign available to Rome of their military might and dominance, designed to absolutely strike terror into the hearts of the Britons. A war elephant from North Africa, a tamed, chained war elephant. And if you can imagine, if you have never seen anything larger than a bear or a large deer in your entire life and you didn't know elephants existed, it most certainly would have caused great fear and awe to all of the Britons who saw him. From this point, having established a foothold, Romans continued to fan out across the country, and by roughly 60 AD or so, they had conquered virtually all of England and Wales, and they were advancing into southern Scotland. Rome quickly started to Romanize the Britons, as they did everywhere in the empire. They began to build great Roman works of architecture and started outfitting existing towns with sort of the standard features and advanced urban planning of the Roman world. So that's things like forums and public baths, things like that. They dealt very harshly with dissent from the local tribes. They mercilessly slaughtered all of the existing Celtic druids, who were the priests of the pagan religions there, and put down a number of violent uprisings, most notable of which was led by Boudica, who was queen of the Iceni tribe, who actually managed to destroy an entire Roman military colony and inflict a couple of other defeats before being absolutely crushed at the Battle of Watling Street, despite the fact that they outnumbered Rome 20-1. Eventually, the worst uprisings, such as these, had been put down, and the Britons settled into a new way of life under Rome. And for a while, this was tolerable and actually quite profitable for many. Largely because, since it was such an untamed land, essentially, Rome at all times kept Britain garrisoned with as many as 40 to 50,000 men. And these men needed supplies, they needed weapons, and they didn't turn to themselves to gather those, they turned to the Britons. And the Britons became quite wealthy, at least some of them did. But there was a lot of money to be had. Rome would go on to expand the province of Britannia to the far north. It's hard to see, but if you can see in the picture, there are two black lines at the top of England. One is Hadrian's Wall, which was a very well defended wall against the tribes from Scotland. And then further north is the Antonine Wall, which they tried to establish in Scotland, but were never successful. They could never hold back the Scottish tribes. And Hadrian's Wall ended up serving for almost the entirety of the existence of Roman Britain as the northern border, both of Britain and the Roman world entirely. But there was a fundamental problem with Roman Britain, one that was never remedied ever. And it was really actually quite an interesting paradox, because since so many troops were stationed in Britannia, it became an established tradition among all Roman emperors to appoint a governor for the province that was someone that was well trusted, usually an ambitious man. Oftentimes they were men from the army, and even at one time the Emperor Vespasian served as the governor of Britannia before he became emperor. But the problem became apparent when the Roman Civil War started to break out. And the problem was that by stationing at Britannia such a large force of men and a very competent, ambitious governor who was often from the military, whenever an emperor would die or a conflict would arise where multiple claims to the throne of the empire came about, usually, well, not usually, but at least several times, that governor in Britain took every Roman soldier in Britain to go fight. And that presents two immediately critical realities for the people that are left there in Britain. One, all of the soldiers in the forts that needed the weapons and the supplies that paid the Britons to make were gone. So nearly all Britons under Roman rule were suddenly entirely without jobs, which was made much worse by the fact that the same governors and their forces that had left turned to members of the tribes that were there to collect really almost bleed them dry sort of taxes to finance the wars on the continent. And then second, the entire province was basically undefended at this point, which left it obviously exposed not just to raids from tribes to the north and then tribes from Ireland, but also from uprisings within. But this was just one difficulty that was presented by the task of holding Britain for Rome. Almost from the beginning, despite all the goods and the precious metals that they were able to extract from Britain, Rome was constantly running at a deficit between how much Britain produced economically and how much it cost to maintain the province. At one point, we're told that it costs more than 4 times as much to maintain and administrate the province as the Britons were producing. And though Rome was able to suppress the worst of the civilian uprisings, they were consistently decimated, consistently lost whenever they tried to march into Scotland. The tribes like the Picts and the Caledonians routinely beat them back, usually through numerical advantage, but also just by absolutely demoralizing savagery in battle. And over time, it became less and less and less desirable for Rome to occupy Britain. And eventually they began to withdraw over a period of some years. The final withdrawal of Roman troops and administrators ends in 410, ending almost 4 centuries of Roman rule. Now, why do we bother to go back that far and talk about a period of time that definitely doesn't feature the Anglo-Saxons that we're supposed to be talking about? Because of what comes next after the end of Roman Britain. When Rome left, many were glad to see them gone. They had been brutal in their taxation and how they suppressed civilian uprisings, any civilian uprisings against Roman rule. But the problem was that by this time, 410 or later AD, no one was alive in Britannia had ever known a day where the Romans didn't rule over them. All they'd ever known was the civil administration put into place. All they'd ever known had become the Romano-British culture and that way of life. They didn't know how to build these great buildings and these works that the Romans had built. They didn't know how to maintain the roads properly or the water supplies or the sanitation systems. They weren't privy to all the details of how Rome made cities run. And so as the Britons began to return to some of their old ways of life, they began to abandon the cities. For many years after Rome left, many years, cities like London, Colchester, Winchester, some of the largest cities in the former province, went from having tens of thousands of people to essentially being ghost towns. And even though the loyalties of the British tribes were never fully to Rome, they were mostly to their tribal lineage, no one knew what a world without Rome looked like. While the Britons did partially return to their old ways, even after Rome was gone, they still maintained some semblance of Roman law and culture. But that centralized system of power being gone led to basically a collapse of what we consider to be organized civilization. But based on the record, as far as we can tell, one very prominent institution that did survive Rome's departure was Christianity. The earliest archaeological record we have of Christianity coming to Britain goes back possibly as early as the 2nd century. And the earliest written record comes from Tertullian, if you remember him from a while back, in roughly 200 AD, when he described, quote, all the limits of the Spains and the diverse nations of the Gauls and the haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. We see evidence of Christian churches, Christian burial grounds, and Christian communities in the 3rd century and on from there. That's not to say there weren't still pagans. The majority of people were still pagans. But all the evidence we have tells us that Christianity did in fact continue to endure in Britain well past the departure of Rome. We even have records of some Christian martyrs, the first being Albinus, known as St. Alban today, who was beheaded in the 3rd century at a former Roman colony. But despite all of that, there was still a void of leadership in Britons. And all of these various tribes fought against each other, largely trying to fill that void. And it's around this time that we begin to see some of the beginnings of really the great legends of British and Welsh mythology, actually. In the 5th century, the tale of Vortigern, who was a king of the Britons, who was said to have fought against the Picts and the Scots in the north before requesting the help of Hengist and Horsa, who were two brothers from the continent, from up and around Denmark, to help defeat the Picts and the Scots. Why does that matter? Because Hengist and Horsa, according to legend, were the two brothers who led the invasion of Britain by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It's here in the 5th century where we first start to see the first incursions into Britain by these tribes, by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And this starts out as a group of warriors helping a British king to fight against northern tribes, and they were given the county of Kent as a gift there in the southeast. But as they fought more and more in sort of this bodyguard capacity for the Britons, they eventually turned on them and warred against them and invited their kinsmen to sail over and join them from the continent. And these sparked a series of wars between these invaders and the British tribes. And it's actually from this time of conflict that you see the genesis of the legend of Uther Pendragon and his son, who you would know as King Arthur. The legend of King Arthur comes from this time when the tribes of Britain fought desperately against waves of these Germanic invaders. Everything we're told about Arthur and Excalibur and his wife Guinevere and the Knights of the Round Table and his battle at Camlin and a wounded Arthur leaving for Avalon and never returning, all of that is based on events that are attested to in this time. Much of the details of Arthurian legend are obviously fancied and dressed up, but the 5th century and the beginning of the Germanic invasions is where we get the origins of the story of Arthur. But it didn't take much time at all for the Germanic invaders to defeat and dominate the Britons. By 570, kingdoms of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes defeat and dominate the Britons. They dominate the eastern half of England, as you can see. Red is kingdoms of the Angles. Brown in the southwest is the Saxons. And then the couple of yellow areas are the Jutes. And they, from the eastern half, continued to sweep across the west and north until they held sway over almost all of what's modern England by the end of the 7th century. Now, these outsiders are quite different from the Britons. The Britons were Celtic in origin. Their ancestors came from Celtic tribes in Gaul and beyond in Europe. They spoke Celtic languages, some of which still exist today. Some of these include the Welsh, the Cornish, and the Breton languages. They also spoke and wrote in the Roman Latin. They were either Christians or they worshipped Brittonic gods. And they had their own distinct culture, which by this time was a mix of the old traditions and the Roman ways. Nearly everything about them was completely different to these tribes that now basically rule them. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, as I've said, were Germanic tribes. They spoke Germanic languages. They were almost entirely pagan, and they had their own religion, their own gods, even though these end up being similar to a lot of the gods of the Britons. And they had their own cultural backdrop, their own practices that they brought to the table. In the course of time, several of these kingdoms came to rise above some of the others. 3 of these were the northern and the eastern kingdoms that belonged to the Angles. These ended up becoming Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. Then there were the Saxon kingdoms in the south and the southwest, which would eventually become known as Essex, Sussex, Middlesex, and Wessex. All of those being shortened versions of originally Old English terms, meaning the East Saxons, the South Saxons, the Middle Saxons, and the West Saxons. And we see during this time that as the Angles and the Saxons in particular, the Jutes sort of wane in influence, and we don't have a lot of record of them. But as the Angles and the Saxons push the tribes westward into what is Wales and Cornwall, they actually start to adopt parts of these native cultures. And part of this includes the gradual adoption of Christianity. In 597, a prior from a monastery in Rome named Augustine, not the same Augustine, the legendary Augustine, was chosen by Pope Gregory the Great to lead a mission into Britain, where he successfully, when he got there, converted the Saxon king Ethelbert, and he established a monastery. He went on to form a diocese in the city of Canterbury, and he became the first archbishop of Canterbury. And that position actually still exists today. In fact, the head of the Anglican Communion worldwide is the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's sort of their pope, so to speak. And Augustine was just one in a series of Christian missionaries and really leaders across the British Isles at this period. The first significant missionary in the British Isles is Patrick, better known as St. Patrick. Patrick was born in Britain, but at the age of 16, he was captured by Irish pirates and taken back to Ireland as a slave. After 6 years, he eventually escaped, but he later returned to witness to and advance the gospel among the Celtic pagans in Ireland, at the time known as Hibernia. Various legends surround his life and time, as you can imagine, some of them being that he was the first to use the shamrock as an analogy for the Trinity, or that he banished all the snakes from Ireland, even though it's a fact that there have never been snakes in Ireland. Another name of note is Columba of Iona, or Saint Columba today. Columba was the first to spread the gospel in Scotland. He founded a monastery on the island of Iona, which is off of the coast of Scotland, and he was one of the first to kickstart what historians today called a Hiberno-Scottish mission, which was a movement that succeeded greatly in winning a lot of converts and founding a lot of churches and monasteries in Scotland and Ireland and eventually Britain as well. So these and others helped to bring about eventually sort of what becomes its own new branch of Christianity. Not a different form, not like Arian Christianity, but just a different flavor of Christianity, which we call today Celtic Christianity. Celtic Christianity which is really just a term that describes sort of the universal practices of basically every church and monastery of Britain, Scotland, and Ireland, is different from what you see in mainland Europe in a few different ways. The first was that they calculated the date of Easter differently. It was by a difference of a day from what the broader church did, but the European church got upset because the Council of Nicaea had established how to date Easter. The second was the issue of what's called monastic tonsure, which is a fancy label that basically means the way in which monks shaved their heads. Monks on the continent shaved the top of their head and they left a circle of hair around to represent Christ's crown of thorns. The Celtic monks apparently didn't do that. We're not told what they did, but they apparently didn't do that. But it was very different, and European churches were very upset with them. The third way was how they performed the sacrament of penance, or confession. Because among the Celts, confession was private. It was made privately to a priest under a seal of secrecy, and it was given privately and performed privately. At this time, in the European church, and just in the broader church, by and large, penance was a public ritual. You came to church in sackcloth and ashes, and you sat away from the rest of the body to display your guilt over your sin. As you can guess, since we know that Roman Catholics today don't publicly do confession, they do it in a confessional, the Celtic practice became popular in Europe to the point where it became established as the norm. And the fourth way was a very popular practice where a lot of people would voluntarily leave their home and their family and live, as they said, in exile for Christ, sort of trusting in the provision of God day by day to survive. This practice is actually why Patrick went back to Ireland. It's why Columba went to Scotland. It's why several other notable saints from the Isles left their homes and evangelized across the British Isles. But aside from these differences, the most notable tradition of Celtic Christianity is monastic life. The Celtic Christians, the Irish by far in particular, cherished the monasteries and the monks. Monasteries across the British Isles were sources of great learning and knowledge in a place and a time of little other education in these early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the kingdoms of Ireland and Scotland. In fact, there are some who argue that the Irish respected monasteries so much that the monastery came to serve as the dominant system of church structure in Ireland. In part because over time, over and against the system of the episcopacy, the bishops, monasteries and those that led them eventually became vested with a great deal of power and wealth. Following the growth of the movement in the 6th century, abbots, who were the leaders of monasteries, not only ended up controlling individual monasteries, but also very expensive estates, and then the secular communities near them that tended to them. So for many Irish Christians, the abbot, who again was the head of the monastery, became sort of their bishop. The monks became their priests. The monastery became their church. But as equally esteemed as the monks on the Isles themselves were, as equally esteemed as them were the so-called green martyrs, those believers that became hermits and relocated to many of the small green islands off of the Irish coast in particular. And perhaps the best example of the life of the green martyrs is at Skellig Michael. Skellig Michael is a small island about 7 miles off the southwest coast of Ireland. By and large, for most of its history, it's been uninhabited, and you can see why that would be. It's basically a greenish spike of rock sticking out of the ocean. But Skellig Michael is actually home to one of the best-known Celtic monasteries. This was the monastery of the monks of St. Fiannan. Every building they built, as you can probably see, and every building they lived in is made entirely of stone from the island itself. The monastery was home to about a dozen monks who lived in these sort of beehive-shaped huts. These were their homes, believe it or not. And though they're round on the outside, as a note, they're actually rectangular on the inside. I don't know how they pulled that off, but they did. These were built with great care, and to this day, the insides are completely watertight and very well insulated, very warm when it's cold, actually. The monks spent their time praying in the church, studying, and tending to their gardens, as much as you could do on such a small space. It was eventually abandoned in the 1200s, the monastery was, but to this day, it has remained a place of pilgrimage, both for Christians and for secular people as well. But this was how much monasticism was revered in the British Isles, and especially, as I said, in Ireland, that people would decide to go live in stone buildings on a rocky island 7 miles from land. The Anglo-Saxons, actually in Britain, ended up making their own contribution to the monastic tradition as well, in the form of what's called the double monastery. Quite simply, the double monastery housed monks and nuns. It had a monastery, and as I said, it had the nuns. They both shared the same church, but they did not ever mix company, despite how that picture may look. And both groups devoted themselves entirely to celibacy and prayerful, godly lives. And the idea of the double monastery becomes very popular, spreads across much of the rest of Europe. And it gets to the point where some of them, mainly those that are built on strategic sites like near rivers or coasts, end up becoming fabulously wealthy and powerful over multiple generations, and they become centers of art and of learning. So Christianity in the British Isles, as I said, has a different feel and a different flavor to it, which both contributed to, and then as we've seen, generated controversy within the development of the broader church. Now I think is a great time to go ahead and take our break, so we will take our break. I'll see you back at 7:10. between 580 and roughly 800, all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms convert to Christianity. They continue to clash with each other, and then with raiding tribes from Scotland and Ireland still, they grab land along the way. The borders of the kingdoms are largely set by this point. A ruling class of elite warriors and merchants are cemented into place, and many of them actually go on to join the monasteries. That, in fact, becomes a tradition, which helps the monasteries become the most powerful institutions in the British Isles for several centuries. But fast forward now to the 9th century, until the beginning of the 800s. Since the beginning of the 600s, the most prominent of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been the kingdom of Mercia, which you may be able to see the name Mercia there in the middle of that pink there. They had come to politically and militarily almost entirely dominate England, to the point where even Charlemagne from across the Channel publicly recognized their dominance. But beginning in the 800s, they began to fade, and they were gradually replaced at the top by the southern kingdom of Wessex. And beginning with the first king of Wessex, King Egbert, in the early 800s, they were able to slowly turn the tables against Mercia, and part of this was actually this was helped in large part, I should say, by the Vikings. Here you'll see more examples of how the Vikings play into things. In 793, Viking raiders sacked a great monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, which is just off the northeast coast of England by Northumbria. This was of tremendous, almost indescribable significance at the time for a couple of reasons. First was how important the monastery was to the nearby kingdom of Northumbria, to all of Britain, and even to Europe. Lindisfarne was a respected hub of learning across all of Europe. But the monastery in particular was at the point, or was really the point from which the Christian faith spread out into both northern and central England. In the eyes of the Northumbrians in particular, one described it as having attacked the sacred heart of the Northumbrian kingdom, desecrating the very place where the Christian religion began in their nation. The second reason why this was significant had to do with how surprising it was that the Vikings raided from the sea. To the more southerly kingdoms, which had not really focused on the north in some time, and they were focused on their own politics when where they were, it was shocking that the Vikings would hit at what at that point was an isolated and underprepared target. It was equally surprising to the Vikings that Lindisfarne and then other settlements along the northeast coast of England were so unprepared and underdefended. They, at Lindisfarne, beat and killed most of the monks, stole basically everything of value from the monastery. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which records much of the history of the Anglo-Saxons, we see this remark about what happened there at Lindisfarne from the Old English, actually. In this year fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year, on 6th Ides of January, the ravaging by wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. Another remark about this, a scholar from Northumbria, actually, who at the time was on Charlemagne's court, had this to say about it. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. There had been small Viking raids before on individual settlements in England, but they were just that. They were small raids, one-off sort of raids on individual settlements. Nothing from this point could have prepared anyone in England for what the Vikings did at Lindisfarne. And that event in 793 is considered today to be the beginning of what's known as the Viking age, which we'll talk much more about next week. We'll see how the Vikings will, for a time, actually come to control most of England and draw enormous wealth from vast trade routes with nations across Europe and Asia. And they almost certainly, the Vikings, would have conquered the whole of England, were it not for the only truly British monarch to ever be called the Great, King Alfred of Wessex. Alfred, by the standard of the day, should never have been King of Wessex. He was the youngest of 6 children of the King of Wessex, Athelwulf. He had 4 older brothers, 3 of whom, Athelbald, Athelbert, and Athelred, each served consecutively as the King of Wessex from 858 to 871. But all of them died, and they left the throne to Alfred. So he becomes king of, at the time, the West Saxons in 871. And even though he normally wouldn't have been king, by far and away, he was the best man for the job in hindsight. When Alfred comes to the throne, Britain is in crisis. In 865, an immense coalition of Vikings from primarily Denmark, but also Norway and Sweden, invaded East Anglia. These Norse pagans soon became known there as the Great Heathen Army. And by the 870s, they had come to control all of East Anglia and much of Mercia and Northumbria. This area of Danish control came to be known as the Danelaw, which on this map is there in the pink. The Danelaw being an area where the Vikings were the ruling elite, and Danish laws trumped over the Anglo-Saxon laws. What little remained of Mercia and Northumbria was far too weak to challenge the Danes on their own, which left Wessex as the last truly free kingdom of England. And so it fell to Alfred to protect his realm and to help what remained of Mercia in repelling further Viking attacks. But for quite a while, several years, the Danes continued to defeat the Saxons and push them back. Alfred eventually has to pay them off to get them to leave Wessex. As they left to conquer other parts of England, Alfred sets about building his defenses and trying to maintain an uneasy peace with the Vikings, but this doesn't last. By 878, Wessex is the last free kingdom of England. The Danes, in December of 878, attacked the city of Chippenham, where Alfred actually was staying for the Christmas season. And they kill most of the people there. Alfred manages to escape, though, and he flees to the marshes of Somerset in the west. And it's in Somerset where we actually see a legend come into being, really about the character of Alfred. The story goes that when he makes it to Somerset, he stumbles into a homestead there, and he asks the family living there if they would shelter him, even though he didn't actually tell them who he was. He didn't say, "I am the king." But they did take him in, and he sort of laid low for a while. And apparently a day comes when he's asked by the woman of the house to keep an eye on some wheat cakes that are baking in the hearth. For whatever reason, he becomes distracted, and he allows the cakes to burn. And so the woman returns. Obviously, she berates him for berates him for letting the cakes burn. There we go. And this is actually where the issue of his character comes up. Because at this point, he could have just stood up and said, "Who are you to talk to the King of Wessex?" Or really anything to that effect. But instead, we're told that he took that tongue lashing and he actually apologized. And most historians today believe that this is a later invention, this story, but it does hit on a point that is actually without doubt perhaps more than any other Britannic or Anglo-Saxon king before him. Alfred was a kind, learned, and pious man, a devoutly Christian king, a shining example of what royal godliness is supposed to look like. And we'll see more of that in a moment. He does go on to win a hugely important battle against the Danes at Edington in May of 878. And he chases them back to Chippenham, where he lays siege, and eventually he starves them into surrender. He, in his terms of peace, requires them to leave Wessex and return to East Anglia. And he also requires that the king of the Danes, Guthrum, convert to Christianity and be baptized, which he does, actually, along with 30 of his best men. So they leave, and Alfred has won. From here, Alfred goes on to do a great many things. He builds a great number of what are called boroughs, which are fortified settlements designed to hold a large enough number of men that an attacker anywhere in Wessex or in the holdings of Wessex was never more than a day's ride away for Saxon forces to confront them. These boroughs range from former Roman towns that had existing fortifications like Winchester in the south to towns with these massive earthen walls and wide ditches defending them on the outside, such as Oxford. Alfred also began to build up his navy. He had 60 ships to, it was an existing force, but it wasn't what we think of today when we think of the English navy. And Alfred and the West Saxons eventually go on to conquer more land that was once part of Mercia and East Anglia, to the point that by his death, he had become the first to be called King of the Anglo-Saxons, which would eventually actually be shortened to the King of England. So Alfred was, in effect, the first king of a truly united England and an English people. But outside of his military exploits, he brought so much more to the table. He adds many new laws to the Saxon law code of the day, most of which were actually based on his understanding of the Ten Commandments and the Old Testament law. He improves the diplomatic standing of the Saxons with their Celtic neighbors to the west in Wales and Cornwall. He sends ambassadors to the papal court in Rome and also to Jerusalem. But what's more significant is what he did when it came to education and the church. Alfred was all too aware, once he had defeated the Vikings, of just how devastating their attacks were on Wessex and the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, especially in regard to the systems of education that were in place. In his own translation of Pope Gregory's pastoral rule, he remarked that, quote, learning had declined so thoroughly in England that there were very few men on this side of the Humber, which is a river in the north, who could understand their divine services in English or even translate a single letter from Latin into English. And I suppose that there were not many beyond the Humber either. There were, at this time, actually clerics on his court that spoke Latin and wrote in Latin, so this is an exaggeration a little bit, but it was still a serious issue. So his solution was to embark on a massive translation campaign, wherein he ordered the translation of many important books and manuscripts of the day into the vernacular language of the people, which at the time was Old English. He himself was even involved in the process directly. He single-handedly translates Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, the Soliloquies by Augustine, and the first 50 Psalms that you find in the Psalter. For Alfred, this translation campaign was designed to provide for people, in his words, those works which he deemed most necessary for all men to know, is how he put it. But most importantly, he oversaw the translation of the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, into Old English, and personally saw to it that all of the churches possessed a copy of it, much like Charlemagne did for the Frankish Empire, if you remember. Alfred did all this because he saw himself as responsible for both the temporal, the earthly, and the spiritual health of his subjects. He does not put secular and spiritual affairs into different categories. He did not, though, despite all this, undertake any major church-wide reforms of practice or liturgy. He believed the best thing to do for the church was to appoint pious, learned, trustworthy bishops and abbots over the monasteries. Restoring religion and learning in Wessex and in England was, in Alfred's mind, as essential to his defense of the realm as him building the boroughs, the fortified settlements. In his preface to the translation of the Pastoral Care, he wrote that kings who fail to obey their divine duty to promote learning can expect earthly punishments to befall their people. The pursuit of wisdom, he wrote in the Consolation of Philosophy, was the surest path to power. As he said, study wisdom then, and when you have learned it, condemn it not. For I tell you that by its means you may without fail attain to power, even though not desiring it. If the Christian faith fell into ruin in his kingdom, if the clergy were too ignorant to understand the Latin words that they were butchering in their offices and liturgies, if the monasteries and the churches were deserted out of indifference of the people, he was answerable to all of that before God, as in his mind Josiah had been. He truly believed, Alfred did, that his ultimate responsibility was the pastoral care of his people. But beyond that, he was also just a man of quality, a man of character. He loved books. One great story of his youth said that when he was young, around 6, his mother held up a book of Saxon poetry to him and his brothers, and she said that, "I shall give this book to whichever of you can learn it the fastest." And so Alfred took that book at 6, took it to his teacher, learned it, memorized it, and then recited it back to his mother, which was all the more impressive by the fact that he didn't know how to read till he was 12. We're also told that he, at all times during his life, carried around a small book with him, probably a medieval version of a pocket notebook almost, that contained psalms and many prayers, actually, that he often collected. His biographer at the time wrote that he collected in a single book, "As I have seen for myself. Amid all the affairs of the present life, he took it around with him everywhere for the sake of prayer, and was inseparable from it." Alfred and his later wife Aelswith had 6 children. His oldest son Edward would actually go on to succeed his father as king of the Anglo-Saxons. And by the time of his death, Alfred dies of an unknown illness on October 6th of 899. He was buried at Newminster Abbey in Winchester. But in what I think is one of the sad stories of history, when the Normans conquered England, they destroyed most of the abbeys and replaced them with Norman cathedrals. And when this happened, they destroyed Newminster Abbey. And that in turn destroyed the sarcophagus of Alfred. And his bones were forever lost to history. Normally at this time, a king's bones or body would have been moved if this were a real threat. But the Normans struck too quickly, and so we still don't know where his bones are today, and we'll probably never know. And this act of putting in these Norman cathedrals is one of many sweeping changes brought in by the Normans, these new masters of England. To briefly summarize who we're talking about, the Normans come from Normandy, if you can imagine, in northern France, right across the channel. Despite the fact that they spoke French, Old French, and they were part of the broader Frankish culture, they were actually the descendants of Vikings. Their ancestors had been given the area of Normandy in the 800s in exchange for an end to their raids on the Franks, particularly against Paris, actually. On Easter in the 800s, they sacked Paris. They also required their conversion to Christianity in order to receive the land. So the Normans begin to grow in power in the region, and then a perfect opportunity comes about. During the early 1000s, in a series of battles between 2 challengers to the English throne, one English and one Norwegian, actually, William, who was the Duke of Normandy, asserts his own claim to the English throne. And when it became apparent to him that no one was just going to hand it over to him, he took an army and crossed the channel, and he landed in southern England in late September of 1066. Right around the same time, actually, in the north of England, Vikings invaded under their own king. And despite, though, having this extra combatant in the mix, the Normans were able to inflict defeats on all of them, all forces, culminating in the Battle of Hastings on October 14th in 1066, which was a runaway victory for the Norman army. And even though it took until about 1072 for them to fully cement control over England, almost immediately the Normans began implementing changes to all of English society. They seized almost all the lands of the English nobility and they parceled it out amongst themselves. And William actually would go on to grant titles and land in both England and France, which will actually end up becoming a big problem much later on. But through a system of what at the time was called enfeoffment, everything, all the lands that William gave out still belonged to him. And everyone who had lands was just entrusted with the lands, these various nobles. They also, at the highest levels of society and the nobility, they eliminated entirely the use of Old English, and they replaced it with spoken Old French and written Latin. We are relatively certain that the Norman nobility, the highest levels of the Normans, never bothered to learn the Old English within reason. But many old French words and just later French words actually did go on to influence the Old English language. You begin to see names like William, Robert, and Richard, which became very popular. You see here some examples of what words looked like an Anglo-Saxon and then their old French equivalent, where you still see both in English today. We still have swine and pork, chicken and poultry, buy and purchase, forgive, pardon. We still have those today. And that's significant because before 1066, anyone who spoke Old English had almost never borrowed words from other languages. The only exception you see is a little bit from the Vikings, but they begin to borrow more words to the point that today only a little over 25% of all words in the English language are actually English words. The two biggest sources of modern English words are actually Latin and French. The Normans also began to construct their own works of architecture, a notable example of which was the Tower of London, if you've ever seen that. Many English citizens emigrate to other parts of Europe during this time. They become actually intensely popular in the Byzantine Empire, where there was great demand for mercenaries and the services of the Englishmen there. The Normans did do a good thing, though, and abolished the existing English slave trade. And they also had the good sense to realize that the English systems of government and taxation that were in place, which were vastly superior to almost anything in Europe at the time, were best left run as they always had. But the thing that had the biggest impact on England's future was what the Normans didn't do. From the time the Normans solidify control in 1072, up until the mid-1200s, the Normans were in effect absentee rulers. William himself, during all his time being King of England, spent more than 80% of his time in France rather than England. This system of mostly absentee rulers would come to have an enormous impact on the future of both countries, actually. And you would see both French and English kings do this as the two kingdoms fought back and forth over time. For centuries, control of vast swathes of England and France swung back and forth in possession between the two. And Norman control would eventually go on to morph into what is called Angevin control, the Angevin Empire, which is just French kings essentially under a different name, owning England and close to half of France. The most notable of the Angevin kings, if you remember Richard the Lionheart from the story of Robin Hood, who we will also talk about when we get to that. Richard the Lionheart was actually one of the Angevin kings, and he was also just as guilty of spending almost all of his time in France. He didn't actually ever speak English. So this back and forth goes on for centuries, as I said, and eventually it goes on to culminate in the 100 Years' War, which was actually 116 years, but the 100 Years' War. And the 100 Years' War is, as we know, the final epic power struggle between England and France for control over those countries, which we'll learn about sometime from now. But all of that to say, as we have charted over 1,000 years of the history of the Anglo-Saxons and the broader history of England, we see things morph from Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England to an England in Norman captivity and then beyond. England, though, for everything that happened during this time, only ever had one Alfred. And really, there was only ever one king like Alfred in the Middle Ages. Many English kings did good things, great things, some did. But there was really only one English king during the Middle Ages that was both intensely pious and highly educated, and that was Alfred. And as I've said a couple of times, to this day, He is the only English-born King of England to have the title the Great. Next week, we will wrap up this three-part series with a look at the Vikings, perhaps the most misunderstood people of the entire Middle Ages to this day. I mean, just the fact that the Minnesota Vikings have horns on their helmets show you one small example of how they're misunderstood. But despite how misunderstood they were then and are now, these Scandinavian seafarers and traders would, in just under 300 years, permanently affect not only England and France, but all of Europe and beyond, all the way to the present day. But until then, have a good night.